a conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near. And just passed right.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back, and we have a brand new guest on. Drew Deitch is here to discuss the 2018 film Halloween. You know, there are so many, we need to specify which one we are talking about. And Drew, you have been a guest on Chat Cemetery. The episode is not out yet, but you know, we recorded it a while ago at this point, a couple months ago, I think, in my attempt to get ahead on that. And I am very glad you also volunteered yourself for Welcome to Geekdom episodes here, because there are plenty of horror movies that I either have watched and haven't discussed on here or have yet to watch because I'm really bad at watching movies in a timely manner. I'm getting better at it with AMC A-List here, but you know, Halloween was something I actually was able to go to the theaters and watch because of having that subscription service. So that is very handy, especially as of late. And I think with this being a direct sequel, it was important to sort of talk about this one, and I do plan on doing the original as well, and then everything in between I'm kind of like, maybe I'll get to those.
Yeah, I mean, I confess to have seen all of the Halloween movies multiple times. It's probably not the best horror franchise, but it might be the one I'm the most familiar with,
Right?
because the original movie is absolutely one of my all-time, way up there favorite movies, not just favorite horror movies, just I love the first film. And it's interesting with Halloween 2018 because this is clearly a concept. You know, the Halloween's often seen as the movie that kicked off the slasher boom of the 80s. You know, it came out in 78, and then 2 years later Friday the 13th comes out and pretty much rips it off and really gets things going. But Halloween has always had a classier air about it, and a almost a prestige level, especially in the horror community. And Halloween 2018, you know, that this was a very interesting direction for them to take, because the original movie had been rebooted in 2007, I believe, by Rob Zombie. And then there was also a sequel, Halloween H2O, in 1998, which was 20 years after the original movie, which was the first time Jamie Lee Curtis came back since the original sequel, Halloween 2, and had a very strong hand in where she wanted to take the Laurie Strode character and what she wanted to say about it, and in regards to how we deal with trauma and how we carry it with us and how it shapes our lives. And a lot of those same through lines are present in Halloween 2018, but in a very, very different way.
Absolutely. And I think what appealed to me with this movie was the fact that you had the Blumhouse name attached to it, because I wasn't super familiar with this company until I watched Get Out. I may have seen some other things they did and not realized it at the time, but with Get Out, I was like, okay, I dig this kind of horror thriller movie. And then I saw the trailer for Halloween and I was like, okay, you know, I remember watching the original as a kid, probably earlier than I should have. I'm sure I had gone over to a friend's house for Halloween and we kind of just put on movies that we normally wouldn't get to watch at our own house. And, you know, that stuck with me all of these years, even though I hadn't really revisited the movie or gone and sought out the other, you know, what is it, 9 movies or something like that at this point. And so when I saw this and I saw that Jamie Lee Curtis was behind it, and we'll get into the casting here in a moment, it just made me so excited for a horror movie like this to be hitting the big screen in 2018. And the fact that it is a direct sequel, I was like, okay, I am very interested to see what they do with this, because even though people did go see all of those other Halloween movies, I feel like this one had the opportunity to be better than most of those.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Blumhouse, and Blumhouse is kind of I kind of call Blumhouse now the the Marvel of horror, because
Yeah.
everybody's like, just give it to Blumhouse. They'll do it correctly. And in a way, I find it interesting because Blumhouse has a great balance where they have these kind of prestige pictures like Get Out, or even I would call Halloween one of their prestige pictures because it was an already established franchise that they got to play with. And, you know, now just recently it's been announced that Universal is going to hand them their catalog of classic monsters. So they clearly have an understanding and a love and appreciation for the genre, but they also put out pretty down the line horror movies. Like they had like Truth or Dare,
Right.
I think last year. So they're not just prestige stuff. They do it all. And I respect that. And I respect that with Halloween, they clearly wanted to make something that was reverential to the original film, but also was able to follow its own path stylistically, that it wasn't going to just be a fan servicey retread, that it really stands on its own merits in terms of directorial style and intent and mood, while having the correct parts of DNA that made the original so classic.
One of the other things I noticed too is that they didn't go over the top with this. You know, the budget was very, very small given the fact that Jamie Lee Curtis is in this movie. The budget was around 10 to 15 million and it made over 250 million at the box office. And what it made is essentially a budget for a Marvel movie, you know, sometimes less depending on which Marvel movie it is. So, you know, I think when you have movies like this and Get Out and even something like A Quiet Place, I really like that sort of budget range for horror movies because you can still do so much with it as long as you aren't going all out with some crazy CGI idea that needs to be done.
I am very much here for this resurgence of the mid-budget movie.
Yeah.
Because for a long time, it was one extreme or the other. It's like, we're either making this for $1 to $5 million or 75 to 200 million. There was a period of time in the 2000s where that was pretty much every wide release movie fell somewhere within that budget range. And
Right.
it was unfortunate because with such extremes, I think kind of the critical extremes followed that. And Blumhouse has figured out this really nice, perfect niche where they're like, this is what we can budget. It means we'll be able to get good talent and good production value out of a relatively cheaper, you know, bottom line. But the most important thing is that we're going to hire people, you know, directors and writers who have a passion for this genre and have some real skill apparent. I mean, you know, it's so bizarre to me that what is probably the best Halloween movie since the original is directed by David Gordon Green and written by Danny McBride. These guys are primarily known as, you know, comedy, and they completely got how to approach this from that kind, because so many times with comedy you have to come at it from a low budget perspective, and I think that actually makes them kind of perfect for approaching horror.
Exactly. To touch on the casting real quick here, what do you think about the fact that they built up this story with Jamie Lee Curtis that I think maybe a lot of us weren't expecting? They surrounded her with cast members like Judy Greer as her daughter, and you have Will Patton as Officer Hawkins, and you can tell he's one of those characters who has sort of been around for a while. He's like, oh boy, this is not good.
There's a real great generational approach to this where there is kind of the old guard like Jamie Lee and Will Patton, who know of the evil that's out there in the world. There's a kind of theme going through the movie where the older generation is trying to tell the younger generation, look, things are going to be bad and you're going to have to fight this. Like, it's not something you can ignore and bury. You need to be ready for the evils of the world, because they're going to come at you when you least expect it. And, you know, Jamie Lee Curtis, she's royalty. Like, there's no denying that at this point. Like, she is royalty to horror fans, to just, you know, as an actor, she's pretty much consistently great in everything I've ever seen her in.
Right.
And I think what's really fascinating about this movie and the way that they approach her character of Laurie Strode and Jamie Lee's performance of it is that, in a way, they start to shape her at the beginning of the film as she is letting this trauma so much consume her life that she's taking on the traits of Michael Myers. And that's really kind of a bold decision. Early in the movie, there's a reference to the first film in which Laurie's granddaughter is sitting in class and she looks out the window and she sees Laurie standing outside the school. That is what Michael does to Laurie in the first movie.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay, this is making a correlation between these characters, and that Laurie's decision to let Michael consume her life has, you know, it's a battle not with monsters lest you become one kind of thing. And Jamie Lee in this movie, not only does she get to do kind of the thing that I think is more broadly audience appealing and do kind of the Sigourney Weaver, Ellen Ripley and Aliens kind of, you know, Linda Hamilton and Terminator 2 type thing. But my favorite moment for Jamie Lee in this movie, in terms of performance and character, is she is sitting outside the facility where Michael Myers is going to be transferred from, where he's going to be transferred to. That's it. Like, he's going to be locked up forever. And she sits out there, and the soundtrack is swelling with hints of the Halloween theme and the siren alarm that's going off signaling the transfer. And she's sitting there watching him get taken out, and she's got a gun, and she just starts to break down. And for just a couple of seconds, out of her peripheral vision, she sees the shape, and the way she plays it, that scene is probably the best emotional exploration of that character in any of the Halloween films.
Oh, absolutely. What I think helps too is the fact that they make this feel so realistic too. You know, we have people like the Ted Bundys of the world, and there are essentially real versions of Michael Myers out there. Maybe not with the exact mask or anything like that, but these kinds of people do exist. And then you have victims like the one that Jamie Lee Curtis plays in Laurie Strode, and they react differently to these things. So to see her take this performance to this whole other level that maybe we couldn't have possibly predicted when the original movie ended. You know, we didn't really know how she was going to carry this with her all of these years until we got this sequel. And I think that's something that they did really well too. I didn't know what to expect going into this. I was like, you know, obviously this would have an impact on someone, on anyone really, if this happened to them. And you sort of just see how much it has not only worn her down over the years, but how much of a wall she's had to build up. And her house in the middle of nowhere is just this insane death trap for anyone who isn't her.
It's this amazing fortress, and what gets revealed in the movie, like you said, that it's a trap. Like, it's something she's been planning for her whole life. It's a sad take on the character. What's interesting is that in Halloween H2O, they do a very different take of this, where she's kind of reinvented herself. She's a teacher in like a California private school, and she's got a new name, and she pretty much just tries to ignore everything about what happened to her in the original movie. And of course it ends up coming back again. She has to confront it. That's one exploration of trauma, is people who bury it and how it continues to kind of inform their decisions, whether they like it or not. But I think the more interesting take is Halloween 2018, where she has embraced the trauma so much. She's gotten so close to it that she almost can't see the forest for the trees. And
Right.
even though in the end of the movie, she is proven 100% right. Like I knew Michael was going to break out. I knew this was going to happen again. There's also that great scene where she and Will Patton are kind of having a confrontation when she's like, I know this is Michael. And she says, I prayed that he would break out. And he says, why? She says, so I could kill him. And of course, in the trailers, that's where they left it out, because it's like, ooh, that's a badass moment. But then
Yeah.
Will Patton's line right after it was, that was a stupid thing to pray for. It's like, yeah, he's right. Like,
Yeah.
it's much more complex than I think, from a character perspective, than I think people were really expecting going in.
I think that shows you the two different ways to react to this, because Will Patton as Officer Hawkins, he's been in that town for a very long time too. He is someone who understands what is happening, and he doesn't want to have to relive that all over again if Michael gets out, whereas Laurie wants to put an end to her own suffering because of Michael. If he's dead, there's no way he can come back from that.
Yeah, unfortunately, to do that, she has to buy into, but that means Michael's going to be out. People are going to die. Like that's kind of the fallout of her wish. And even so that it impacts her own family directly. And that this is a trauma that ends up having to be passed down to them. And I think that I will say I love Judy Greer, and will watch her in pretty much anything she does. I think her character as Laurie's daughter gets a little bit of a short shrift in the script. I don't think we spend either enough time with her or the right kind of time with her to make her arc feel quite as successful as Laurie and Laurie's granddaughter.
Yeah, she's sort of that in between the granddaughter and Laurie, because she obviously wants Laurie to stay away for a reason, but it isn't really until she shows up at Laurie's house that we see why. And I feel like that is something that definitely could have been explored more. But real quick here, I don't know if we can talk about this movie without talking about the podcasters, because that is something that definitely goes to modernizing this movie, because it's absolutely something that would happen today. We see it with podcasts like Atlanta Monster, and now that same group of people is working on a podcast about the Zodiac. So there's this fascination with serial killers that I don't think will ever go away, just because of how differently their minds work from everyone else's. And you can tell that these podcasters are in over their head right away. Most of these people aren't going and necessarily talking to the killers, or if they do, it's over the phone. They're not trying to talk to them in person or anything like that, so that they know their faces and can come after them when they inevitably escape in a fiction movie.
Well, I think the podcasting angle is the easiest kind of in for a modern audience, because it's something they understand about. Oh, true crime podcast, and true crime's really big, but it's also a very clever way to dole out exposition early in the movie to anybody. Like, I'm sure there are plenty of people who saw this movie and have never seen a Halloween movie, that this was the first one they ever saw. And that entire structure of having these podcasters investigating the case gives you a very natural way of catching the audience up to what information they need to know going into this story. And I think it's all handled very well. And I love, and it kind of threw me the first time I saw it, the opening scene of this movie, which jumps right in with the podcasters going to the sanitarium and trying to interview Michael, and then showing him his mask. Just the build of that and everything was so good. And I like that one of the things I think the later Halloween sequels missed about the original movie is the level of myth that surrounds Michael Myers. He is a human, but he's also the Shape. There's something supernatural about him. It's not something that you can pin down with any kind of direct mythology, but John Carpenter, when he originally made Halloween and has talked about Michael Myers, he's always described Michael Myers as an evil wind that just blows through town. And it's spooky, that opening with them showing the mask, and then all of a sudden all of the inmates freaking out and the dogs barking. You're like, there's something else here.
Right.
And I love that feeling.
Let's actually dive into the myth of the character a little more here, because you see 40 years later that this is still such a big phenomenon for the town, especially once he escapes. And you still have, that abandoned house too, which I think is a huge testament to how the entire town feels about not only Michael Myers, but where he grew up. No one wants that house, Why would they, kind of? But yet it's something that happens all the time, because when you sell a house, you have to, I think, up to so many years, have to disclose what happened in the house, especially if there was a death or a murder or anything like that. And it's definitely something that will turn people off, especially with this being a smaller town from the looks of it. I believe it's filmed out here in Pasadena. That's sort of where the exteriors for some of the houses are from, which, that's not a small town, but the houses sort of give off that vibe, at least, because they're so old, and you can really see just how the town has aged with it in these shots in particular.
Well, I am kind of a sucker, and kind of relating this back to Stephen King a little bit even. I love the idea of the small American town with the dark secret. With
Yes.
that evil thing that's at the heart of what we perceive as perfect Americana. That's always fascinated me, because it's something we refuse to escape as a culture. Like, as much as our art explores it, everybody still wants to believe in Main Street USA and that whole concept. And it's like, that's never been real. There's always been seedier things and darker things. And Michael Myers is this kind of, I think, the perfect culmination of that in a mythic sense, because he's a monster without motive. There aren't human motivations to him. He is just, he's a force of nature in the most evil kind possible. And I love that this movie acknowledges that, even so much so that, John Carpenter, as well as his son Cody Carpenter, and their bandmates got together to do the score for this. And if you read the score tracks, the opening scenes of the movie where before Michael has gotten his mask back, it's always stuff like Michael kills again, or the names of the tracks. But once he gets that mask back, he's the shape returns. And I love that. I love kind of making this modern American monster that, that we can never truly understand the evil behind those eyes. That's so fascinating to me. And I think that what Halloween 2018 gets so right, that all the other sequels never got onto, is not explaining that, like purposely obfuscating that and just saying, like, this is just what he is. It is just an evil thing, and we have to do our best to try and conquer it. We'll never understand it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, again, you can sort of feel the realistic part of this story, because when you think about where certain killers have grown up and how people not necessarily idolize them. I'm sure there are those people, which, probably people you should stay away from, but there's just this fascination there, and people will go visit the places these killers lived and try and get inside their heads in a way that, the FBI is supposed to do, because it's their job. And I think with Michael Myers, that myth is still very much alive even before he breaks out, because you have, I imagine lots of kids daring other kids to go up to the house or go in the house or what have you. And it's sort of this thing that I think is a staple in horror stories. And like you said, sort of hearkening back to Stephen King, that's something that's prevalent in Salem's Lot. You have this big, scary house that was abandoned for years and years until someone moved in. And even then, there was still this sense of, hey, I dare you to go check it out.
Yeah, well, I love it's. They play it off as kind of a cute continuity nod to fans in the movie where Laurie's granddaughter is with her friends and they're talking about, oh, wasn't Michael Myers her brother? And she's like, no, that's just something somebody made up. It's like, oh, that's a cute continuity nod for nerds about the second movie, but it also sets up this idea of like, oh, people like kids 40 years later still know about this and talk about it like the evil town legend, which is great. And I really like in that scene where, again, it feels kind of meta in a sense, where the one kid is like, he just killed 4 or 5 people. It's not that big of a deal. And with other stuff that's going on today, and that approach of saying like, oh, there's always worse things going on. It's like, well, okay, I don't think we should be quantifying these events that way.
Yeah.
And don't worry, you'll pay for your comment later in moralistic slasher fashion. But I like that it's saying, no, matter how relatively, quote, small this seems in comparison to everything else that happens in the world, this was still an important thing that's affected this town, that's affected the people who remember it, that continues to get passed down. This legacy of trauma is what I think is at the core of Halloween 2018. And I think is the stuff that gives it its strongest thematic resonance.
I'm absolutely in agreement with you on that, because it just feels like it has seeped into this town to the point where even generation after generation, they're going to know about it. And even if the story might change over those years, like you said, the comment about the brother and everything, and it's one of those things where you just have to live with it no matter who you are, because you live in this town and it's such a small town, not necessarily where everyone knows everyone extremely well, but it has that feeling to it. And it's one of those things where, because of how fascinated people are with killers like Michael Myers, real or fictional, I'm sure there are some people out there who kind of wish they lived in a town like that, because it would just bring them, something extra to their life, even though it could be terrifying at times, like when he does escape.
We have a fascination as humans and just as a culture with the dark side. I mean, that's all, that's always going to be there. And what I've always loved about Michael Myers as a concept, because he's not truly a character. He is a being. What I've always loved about him is he is the perfect example of the ultimate evil that is this unknowable thing, that right. We'll never truly understand. And we want to. And in this movie, I like that it acknowledges that. There's the character of Dr. Sartain, who's been watching over Michael for years, and is just so intent on like, I want to understand him. I want to know. I want to get him to speak, because Michael never speaks. And I want him to say something so that I can know what he is. And to the very end, that is denied. And I think that's kind of a powerful statement on, you're never going to know the true heart of evil, but it's always going to fascinate you. And if you let yourself, you can become consumed by that desire and end up possibly falling into that void yourself.
Yeah, one other character I want to mention quickly here is the fact that, Dr. Sartain is a former student of Dr. Loomis, who was in the original. So they definitely knew what they were doing when they wanted to keep this continuity going in a way that made perfect sense. Who else would have taken over as Michael's psychiatrist? It's going to be someone who already had this connection. Whether they wanted it or not is another story. And he is too egotistical for his own good. And I don't know who thought that transferring Michael Myers would be a great idea, but that was a very, very dumb idea.
Right. Well, I don't know how spoiler friendly you want to be on this.
Just go for all the spoilers. It's been a while. People have had lots of time.
So yeah, I think it's long enough. And if anybody out there, see this movie. So yeah, Dr. Sartain ends up being the one who's aiding in Michael's escape and is clearly wanting him, facilitates his escape so that he can study him. And so I'm sure he just kind of made up some, BS reason of why he needed to transfer him. So he's like, I got to be on that bus so I can help him break out. Which is again, I appreciate from a script writing position of, okay, we're going to set up this character who Laurie literally says to him, you're the new Loomis. So anybody with any kind of familiarity with the franchise, or even just the familiarity of what's presented in this movie, is like, okay, well, this guy is another guardian, another protector of what Michael can do. But then, of course, the switch being, oh, well, no, actually, he's bad, and he's trying to get Michael to do these things because he thinks seeing Michael in his element will, inform him of some new information about why Michael is the way he is, that it will get Michael to speak. And like when I alluded to it, when Michael crushes his head, and the last thing Sartain says to him, looking up at him on the ground, is just, say something, Michael. And Michael just crushes his head. It's like, that's perfect. That's a great mission statement of, nope, we don't want you to know anything about Michael, because as soon as you start trying to explain the evil, it's going to demystify it, and it's going to take away the element that truly makes Michael Myers scary.
I never wanted to know anything deeper about Michael Myers with either the first original movie or this one, and I imagine I would still feel the same with all of the movies in between as well. But it's just one of those things where he's a killer, and he had his little spree, and it's over now. What else could you possibly want to know about him? There are so many other killers that you could go and study who will happily talk to you. Why is this one so important for, your own ego that it would be worth putting the entire town at risk? Because it's not just Laurie that he's going to go after. Obviously, that's sort of the end game for him, because she's the one who got away. And he was able to, kill all of her friends, or, people who we thought were her friends. It's high school. Who knows?
Yeah.
So, and, it's just this thing that's been eating away at both of them for the last 40 years, I would imagine, even though he's not going to express that. It's like, all right, she's the one who got away, so we are going to end this. And I don't think Michael is necessarily expecting what he finds. But I think at the same time, maybe he's not that surprised that he had this kind of effect on her.
Well, what I love, and I'll bring up H2O again, because in H2O, Michael very actively is searching for Laurie. He's going to places to get information to like hunt her down. But in Halloween 2018, it's much more like the original movie in that Michael Myers doesn't really have a direct agenda. He is just this force. And there are rules that you can kind of infer. For example, Michael's original crime that he committed was when he was a child. And I think he, for the most part, he doesn't hurt children. There's instances in this movie when he's out and everybody's trick-or-treating where he runs into children. Famously, I think from this movie now is he's in the house of a victim and he's walking through and we start hearing a baby crying. And everybody, when I saw it in the theater, just started, you could feel the tension. Like, is he going to kill the baby? And I was like, oh, this is good. But no, he's not, because he has this, unspoken kind of rule set that, what was surprising is early in the movie when he breaks out, he does kill a kid who's probably maybe about like 13 or so, but the kid also has a gun. Like, he is in some way on a level enough playing field with Michael that he's like, all right, you're fair game. But even so, in this movie, it's not like Michael breaks out and immediately just goes straight to killing Laurie. They just end up crossing paths, and as soon as he sees her, he's like, oh, okay, yeah, like you and me, we're doing this. And I love that.
He does kill Allison's friend too. I mean, they're high school age, so I feel like that's a little different.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like it's the younger kids he's more protective of.
Yeah, no, the very little kids and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's like if you've hit puberty, like Michael's like, okay, like you know enough to get out
You're
of this
fair
situation.
game.
Or not. Yeah, but talking about, because this is this is a slasher movie, and people are going to want the base pleasures that come with the subgenre, and I'm so impressed by Halloween that it can be a much deeper movie than just that, but it also delivers on the very kind of, checklist things you want out of a movie like this, which is, interesting kills and good scares and atmosphere. And I love the way Green decides to frame Michael in this movie so many times, to really make him feel like a specter.
Yeah.
The main one, and I think the one that kind of stands out for me, is the sequence on the neighbor's lawn with the motion sensor lights.
Yeah.
Oh, that that entire sequence, just, it was so unnerving. It's played, with no music and the lights going on and off, and he continues to move and be in different places. It was one of my favorite experiences in the movie theater last year. You could just hear everybody squirming in their seats. Like, oh, it was great.
Absolutely. There's such a big deal about how horror movies are filmed too, I think. And even if you go back and watch the one from 40 years ago, you're going to have some element of cheesiness to it because it was the late 70s. Movies weren't too terribly fantastic unless you had a massive budget at that point, I would venture to say. And this is something that, like you said, that mid-level budget, you can do so much with it as long as you aren't trying to CGI a ton of things, like I mentioned earlier. And the practical effects in this just amplify the movie so much, and they don't look nearly as bad as they did 40 years ago. So I think that's something that, even though a lot of people love that original movie, this one was able to take it and modernize it in a way that didn't feel too modern. You have the podcasting aspect, which you wouldn't have had back then, but they stick with those practical effects. And I think that's something that helps movies age a lot better too. You can go back and watch the Star Wars movies and they don't look horrendous the entire time because they use so many costumes and practical effects, and those just hold up better. And I think you can say the same for the Halloween movies.
Yeah, it's so interesting because the original Halloween, considering its notoriety as the granddaddy of all the slashers, it's not a gory movie. There's there's very little to no effects in the movie, and it's that whole kind of low budget approach where we don't have a lot of money, so how are we going to make this work? And it causes filmmakers to usually be inventive in the best of ways. But it's also, I really think it comes down to directorial and cinematographer eyes, because you have John Carpenter and Dean Cundey as the DP on the original, who, Dean Cundey would go on to shoot a bunch of stuff for Spielberg, and they understand, like, look, we don't have a lot of money, so we have to make the style be kind of a character in the movie. I mean, that movie famously opens with a first-person POV shot of Michael as he commits his first murder, which now is just seen as incredibly cliched and part of the slasher subgenre. But that was radical, to put the audience in the eyes of the killer, and then to reveal that this is a kid doing it. And what I love about Halloween 2018 in that respect is it does not feel beholden to the stylistic choices of the 1978 Halloween. It really goes its own path. I mean, the The violence in this movie is brutal, to a point that's, in the best of ways, uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's also interesting, and me and my friend Travis talked about this on our podcast. The way that the movie frames its violence is mostly different between men and women. Not all of them. There's one in particular, but a lot of the shots that involve violence against men, you see it all. Like, it's very up close and gory and brutal. But then, for example, when the female podcaster gets strangled to death, it's all shot at a low angle underneath a bathroom stall. When the one babysitter gets stabbed to death, we never see any kind of contact with the knife. It's just looking at Michael. It feels intentional because it keeps cropping up again and again in the movie. But it also, I think it's great because if the movie was nothing but a cavalcade of gore gags, I think it would feel kind of cheaper. It wouldn't feel quite as impacting. And a lot of the times we don't even see the violence happen. For example, the babysitter's boyfriend, we don't actually see him get killed. He just runs into the house. And then later when I think the Will Patton comes into the house, he's just impaled on the wall. And it's like, oh man, like I like not having to see how everything goes down, but just seeing the aftermath and being like, wow, this guy is a force.
Exactly. I think because the women maybe aren't able to fight back as much as the men, which obviously Laurie is the big exception for that. She's ready to fight back. Maybe, in a way they're sort of doing the women a courtesy of not being completely annihilated in front of the audience. And I don't even know if that would necessarily be a courtesy because we know it's happening. We're just not seeing it. It's
still horrifying and effective, but I think it's, in kind of a bigger summation of that argument, is that if you look at the response to slasher movies, especially during their boom in the 80s, and a lot of those movies aren't good, but people have an affinity for them, they have a reputation, whether it's true or not, of violence against women and being misogynistic, or, just being a male response to women in society at the time, and feeling like, oh, that it feels like a punishment against women. And I definitely see that argument for that era of slashers. And I think Halloween 2018 does the smart thing of, well, look, we're not going to, not have women be victims in this like that. Then that would be its own kind of unfair. But we're going to frame the violence in a way that's almost, I don't want to say more artful, but almost in a way that feels more classical, in that we're not going to show you it, so it actually makes the violence worse because you have to imagine it. And whatever you come up with is going to be way more disturbing than any effects gag that we come up with. Like, not seeing the female podcaster get strangled. It's like, well, you're becoming Michael Myers in that instance because you are seeing him do that in your head. You're killing her in a way. And that's more disturbing and kind of gleefully evil to do to an audience. And I think it again it's one of the things that kind of sets this movie apart from the original, is that it brings you into the killings in a incredibly brutal way. And I think that was even one of John Carpenter's notes to David Gordon Green, was like, if you're going to do this, make it relentless. Don't hold back. And I think that's up there on the screen.
It's certainly there every step of the way. I totally agree. And it's what makes this movie a really good sequel too. And I don't recall what I necessarily rated it after I watched it. I think it was in the 3.5 out of 5 range. And it's one of those things where I could definitely see myself rewatching this just to sort of have it sink in a little more, and maybe that rating will bump up over time, because you don't necessarily catch everything the first time you watch something. And I think with horror, that's particularly true with a franchise like this, or, Freddy, Jason, what have you, because of how meta these sequels can get. And you mentioned a few things earlier, and I'd probably have to watch the original and then immediately watch this one and do a back-to-back thing just so I can sort of wrap my head around everything they actually accomplished with this movie.
Yeah, I think it's in years going to be assessed as something truly miraculous because it is a great companion piece to the original, but it does the envious and nigh impossible task of just being its own thing. Like, obviously, seeing the original movie and having that context enriches Halloween 2018. But, you know, I when I went to see it in the theater, I took my girlfriend, and she hates horror movies. She does not like being scared. We didn't watch the original one. She's like, I kind of know, like, Michael Myers is a guy in a mask and he kills people. That was about it. And we came out, and, you know, I asked her about it and said, you know, what did she think? She was like, I hated it because it was a horror movie and it scared me. But even I have to admit that it's a really good movie. And I asked her, I was like, was not seeing the original, did you? She was like, no, I felt that they presented everything they needed to. I understood Laurie's character arc and where she was coming from and why she was reacting the way she was without seeing the first one. And that was really kind of a testament to me that, yes, this really works. Like, it's something that you don't have to have the original to have this stand on its own two legs. And even though, you know, the movie did incredible business and has been fairly well regarded critically, I think as the years go on and it starts to get amalgamated into the franchise as a larger whole, it's only going to rise in appreciation at seeing, like, wow, it's incredible that they were able to do this and check all the boxes that everybody wants or thinks they want from a Halloween sequel, while also really treating the material with a level of maturity that I don't really think has ever been done before in the franchise.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we dive into the ending and the quote-unquote post-credits scene specifically?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I have to say, and this is, again, a fun little nod to people who love the first movie and also a mission statement, is the opening credits, in which a rotted pumpkin rises up and becomes lit again. And of course, it's a reference to the opening credits of the original film. When it popped up, I just started laughing because it's just this dead, rotted pumpkin. I'm like, that's fun. And then when it started raising up, I'm like, this is brilliant. This is such a stylistic thing to make a point. Like, hey, this has been dead and it's coming back, and we're really taking this seriously. So I love that. And the only other thing I mentioned it lightly, but I really have to praise it, is getting John Carpenter back to do this score. This score is so good.
Yeah.
And I was surprised because I was afraid it was going to feel kind of pastiche, like it was just a score that jumped out of 1978 and they plunked it into this movie, and that it was going to rely a whole bunch on the very famous Halloween theme. It's not really that. It's got a modern slant to it, but doesn't have the kind of, I think, orchestral bombast that we expect from, you know, wide release films. It feels, again, much like the movie, an amazing balance of classic and doing its own thing. So that would be it as far as other things to touch on before we get into the bananas ending of this movie.
Yeah, so to set the scene, you have this death trap of a house that Laurie has set up. Her daughter and her granddaughter end up there, and the son-in-law as well, which that does not go so well for him.
Oh, poor Toby Huss.
Yeah, and you have all of these things going on in the house, and I really love the set for this because they paid so much attention to the details. You have the room that's like full of mannequins and stuff, and you have even outside where she does her target practice and everything like that. The entire kitchen island just moving and revealing this basement room that is essentially a safe room. And just the fact that you could tell this house was very lived in, but not lived in the sense that, it was an enjoyable life. So you just have all of this personality coming out of this house, and it reflects everything that Laurie has been through over these years. And to have Michael end up at that house the way she planned it, and then to have that post-credit scene where you're like, oh no, no, why?
I think one of the most important things in action cinematography, when I say action, I don't mean like the genre, I mean actual action.
Yeah.
And this is kind of maybe the most important for horror, is geography. It's really important for you to understand where characters are in a space and what's surrounding them, where they're going, where they can't go, in order to make us feel the tension of the scene. There's so many movies that you can point to in the filmmaking and saying, like, I don't understand where characters are in relation to each other, where the danger is coming from. And what's so great about Laurie's house is we see enough of it that, like you said, thematically we understand it. It represents her building this kind of fortress unto herself,
right.
And preparing for this. But as the movie progresses and we start to see flashbacks and they keep going back to the house, we reveal it little by little. And during that final sequence, it's revealed that Laurie, or I think they show it a little bit earlier in the movie, but she will basically clear rooms. She goes into a room, checks it out, and once it's done, she pushes a button and a metal shutter shuts it off. I'm like, okay, that part of the geography is gone now. So we're limiting ourselves closer and closer to wherever her final conflict is going to go down. And I love that. That's so smart in putting us in her shoes during that final conflict. Is like, I really do feel like I can walk through that house and understand where everything is and where I need to go. And then, yes, then the actual ending and the revelation, there's a couple just, there's no other way to describe it. It's just badass moments at the end here, in which Judy Greer and her daughter are down in the basement, which is like this safe room gun locker, and she's crying. She's like, I can't. She's holding her gun that she had as a kid, and she's like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And immediately when Michael steps into the frame, it was an act, and she's like, gotcha. And that switch is so great. And then to have Laurie be the one at the end who pops out of the shadows and says, Happy Halloween, Michael. It's like, oh man, you want to talk about a crowd-pleasing succession of moments.
I just got chills thinking about it again.
Yeah, it's so cool and triumphant, and you're like, yes, like as much as so many of these kind of horror movies, like you said, people end up fixating on the killers as kind of the figureheads and really making the merchandising and the passion around these movies about them. This is a moment where in the end you're like, yeah, kill Michael, like get him. Like it's so rousing. And then of course the big reveal that the safe room is not a safe room at all, that it's been this trap. So good. I love this script so much.
I feel like this is something that sequels should all aspire to, in a sense, especially in the horror genre, because you have a lot of horror movies that can be really, really bad, and the franchise will still live on when that happens, especially if it's something as big as Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
And this just so perfectly embodies everything about the town, the characters, the killer, to the point where I feel like the way they did this, there was no way it was going to be a total flop.
It feels crystallized. Like they got the most cut from diamond versions of these characters, and they were like, as long as we nail that, there's a confidence to we're going to be able to deliver all the stuff that the, Friday night date night crowd wants, which is, here's really good crafted jump scares and spooky atmosphere and, vicious kills and stuff. We've got all that covered. What we need to focus on is making sure Laurie and Michael as opposing forces work. And of course the very ending of this movie, in which she's trapped Michael and decides to blow the whole place up, and we get that ambiguous ending cut of seeing him in the basement and then cutting back and he's gone, which is of course a reference to the original movie in which we think he's dead and he escapes and that's it. He's out there.
Yeah.
I love the ending of the 1978 Halloween. I think it might be my favorite horror movie ending of all time. But what I like about the 2018 version is they do that. They're like, oh, he could still be out there. You'll never know. But it doesn't end on that, because this movie isn't about Michael. Mm-hmm. It's about Laurie and her family, and the image of them getting, picked up in this truck and driven away. And the camera pans down to Michael's knife, which Laurie's granddaughter took from him and used against him to eventually drive him into the cellar. Ending on that image, a freeze frame on that image, is again another mission statement, a saying like, this is not about Michael. It's about this thing that has happened to these women and how they're carrying it with them. And they're all carrying it in different ways. But the most important thing is, at the end of the movie, even though they have this horrible thing that's always going to inform some part of their lives, they're dealing with it together. And they're learning to use this trauma as a weapon. And I think that's so, I'll say it again. I think the maturity of that message is something that was so refreshing to see in what could very easily be a by the numbers fun slasher movie.
Right.
I loved that.
I totally agree. It's one of those things where you have to appreciate the amount of time and effort that went into this and all of the details that came out of it, because like you said, those women are handling the trauma in different ways, but now they're sort of all using it as a defense mechanism in the end. Allison had to run away from Michael after he killed her friend, and she just kept running and running and running. And then you see Judy Greer's character, she freaks out because her daughter hasn't come home. And you get these things all happening simultaneously, and you see how each of them is able to handle it. And in the end, they have to come together to defend themselves. And with the post-credits scene of just the heavy breathing from Michael, it's like, okay, yes, he could still be breathing, but that doesn't mean he's necessarily going to make it out alive, even though they want us to believe that. So one of the last things I want to wrap up with here is, what's next for the Halloween franchise? Do you think they'd leave it off on this note, or do you think they're sort of going to milk it, knowing how successful this one was? And I know with Blumhouse, that was a bit of a concern with Get Out because of how well it did. Mm-hmm. It's like, do we need a Get Out 2? Can you really capture this again? And even though the 2018 Halloween is a sequel, I don't know if we need more than that. I would be perfectly content with them leaving it where they did and us sort of just not knowing, because, Laurie has aged a lot over the last 40 years, and it's safe to assume that Michael has as well. So how long can you really keep this up? Or does Michael go find himself a protege or something like that, which I don't think that would be as entertaining in a horror film, to have this protege suddenly come up, 40 plus years later.
Well, I can tell you right now, fans of the series would immediately discount that because they don't like replacements. You always want to leave the audience on a high note, and Halloween 2018 is such a high note for the franchise, for just the horror genre, for the slasher genre. And the only thing that gives me interest in a sequel is that Danny McBride and David Gordon Green originally pitched this as 2 movies. and they said, like, we have a 2-movie arc
Okay.
that we can do. And they were originally going to do that, but then they scaled things back and were like, we don't know, because if we mess up this first one, we're kind of stuck with, you know, story threads and stuff the way that they have it set up, to where, you know, if we don't get to make the second one, it's going to feel very disappointing. Because much like the first Halloween, you know, the first Halloween wasn't set up for any kind of sequels or anything. It was just another kind of statement of you can't kill evil. You can't kill the boogeyman. He's always going to be there somewhere lurking. And while this movie ends on a similar note, it's also, like I said, making that kind of appraisal of what this means to the women that it's affected. You know, I'm almost certain that a sequel will manifest because of its success. I know the cynicism of Hollywood producers, and they never want to let a thing sit for too long if they can make another buck off of it. But I don't know. Like, I don't know where you kind of go thematically, because story-wise they're trying to create a construct of, like, what's Laurie and her family up to now? That's not what would interest me as much as what Halloween 2018 ended up exploring with its characters in a much bigger sense, about, like, this is a movie about trauma. This is a movie about, like, that's what's crazy to me, is that Halloween 2018 is a movie about something.
Yeah. It's not just a horror slasher flick.
Yeah, like, it has real deeper concerns on its mind, and that's my jumping off point to a sequel. It's like, well, if this movie was about trauma and how it continues to affect generations down the line, now that those characters have been confronted with that trauma and have learned, like, yes, this isn't something we can ignore or something that we can, you know, pass off as inconsequential. What's the thematic through line of, well, what do you do now that you know that trauma's out? Like, do Judy Greer and her daughter become like Laurie? Like, it feels triumphant for Laurie, not in a sense that, oh, she beat Michael Myers. It's triumphant in a sense that her and her family now understand one another completely, because they've all gone through the same experience. And I don't know where you go with that. It is at a point where, well, you know, the people behind this hit a home run in my opinion. And if they all come back, then I have faith in them from, you know, just what I've seen. But man, it just feels like a really, really tough nut to crack following this up, because if this won't be the last Halloween movie, we'll get another one in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
But if this was the last one, I'm like, I don't think you could ask for a better, you know, exit to the story.
I would love to know what exactly they ended up pitching for the 2-movie story arc there, because
me too.
that's something that I feel like, you know, as film nerds and myself just sort of becoming more of one lately, I've always been curious about the process of how these films are made. And just to know now that there were 2 movies in someone's head, it's sort of like, oh man, I wish I could hear that story. And maybe one day we will get it. Maybe a podcast that is not mine will get that story and we can all listen to it. But I do agree with you that this just feels like such a good ending, even if it is open-ended, because I think that gives the fans a chance to wonder what if, or what happened. And you sort of get all of these conversations around movies like this. And I don't know if horror fan fiction is necessarily a thing. I know it's really big for comics and anime and things like that, but fans can sort of just go write their own ending to the story and play around with these ideas. And I think that's something that is very exciting about fandoms in general. And Halloween certainly has that cult fan group.
Oh, yeah. And I really think this movie is only going to not only energize the support for this franchise that there already is. But this is a movie that is going to create a new generation
Absolutely.
of people. And that's, in the long run of things, that's the best thing you can hope for with some kind of remake or sequel, is that it not only speaks to the people that have been there with it for a long time, but it captures a new audience. And I know in my experience of seeing this, when we went and saw it in the theater, I'm like, there are people here who are very young, and I would venture that this is the first Halloween movie they'll ever see. And I hope for nothing more than that means that they'll start tracking it down, and that somebody will make the awful mistake that I've done, which is seeing all of the Halloween sequels multiple times. But I want that, like that, the idea that will pass down because of a movie as good as Halloween 2018 is so encouraging.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a fantastic note to wrap this up on. And I will be sure to keep you apprised of my Halloween movie watching habits here.
Oh, yeah. I'm always here for it. Trust me. I've seen these movies more than anyone ever should. So I'm happy to jump on again.
And I am more than happy to have you as a regular guest on this podcast, as well as Chat Cemetery. I know we have a lot of horror to discuss, so it's nice to have someone who really loves this genre to talk to and sort of just hash out these thoughts and ideas about the genre in general as well. And, Drew, I am sure I will have about 20 other movies to throw your way soon, now that I know I have, this person who loves horror so much and really likes to focus on it.
I'm here for it.
Awesome. Well, to our listeners, as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.